Welcome back to Fundamentals of Philosophy. This is Module 2 on Reasoning, and this is going to be Part 1 in a 3-part lecture series, and each one about 20 minutes each. This one we're going to talk about deductive logic, or deductive reasoning, or philosophical logic. In Module 1, we introduce the basic conceptual framework of Western philosophy by taking a look at two of its most central figures, Socrates and Bertrand Russell. And we consider the philosophical beliefs that provide conceptual scaffolding for our ordinary, everyday beliefs. In our second module, we're going to take a closer look at two of the most important tools that philosophers use to critically examine the clarity, reasonableness, and consistency of beliefs: deductive and inductive reasoning. Part 1 of this lecture will be concerned with the development of deductive reasoning, which forms the backbone of philosophical logic, the primary tool used by philosophers for analyzing the truth of concepts. And as a side note, lecturing about logic can be a bit like dancing about architecture, if you get my meaning. Verbal communication just really isn't the right tool for the task. It is highly recommended that you refer to the Module 2 handout in addition to the lectures to help organize and flesh out some of the important terms and concepts that we're going to encounter. So that's what the handouts are for. Take a look at them. There's going to be way more detail in those. I want to try to keep this as narratively streamlined as possible. This lecture, on the other hand, is about machinery. Specifically, it is about the construction of a specific type of machinery, known as an inferential engine. An inferential engine is not necessarily a physical machine. It is any system of technical operations that is optimized for the production of universal certainty. Deductive reasoning, the methodology that lies at the heart of philosophical logic, is one of history's most powerful inferential engines, and its construction begins with a single principle. And it should come as no surprise to learn that the standard history of philosophical logic, in this case, as most others, begins in ancient Athens. After the death of Socrates, Plato founded the Academy, the first school of formal education and the origin of the modern university. Among Plato's students was the philosopher Aristotle. You might have heard of him. Aristotle taught Platonic philosophy at the Academy for many years. But following Plato's death, Aristotle grew a little restless, both in his life and in his philosophy. And he started traveling, as people do. He wandered around ancient Macedonia, where he eventually ended up becoming the instructor of Alexander the Great, as an interesting historical side note. He did return to Athens at the end of that, where he founded the Lyceum, which is a rival school to the Academy that taught a new philosophy that would help shape the next several thousand years of Western thought. Aristotle's contributions to philosophy are many. We'll be coming back around to him in Lecture 6, I believe, Module 6. But for the purposes of this lecture, we'll narrow the lens to focus on his development of what would become the first gear in the clockwork of deductive reasoning and the foundation for all Western logic, the Law of Non-Contradiction. The law is based on a simple observation. A thing cannot be both true and false at the same time. Non-contradiction. Aristotle cannot be in both Athens and not in Athens. Socrates cannot both be mortal and immortal at the same time. Can't have two contradictory properties that are simultaneously true. This is a fairly basic, simple tool. We take it for granted, but I mean, back in the day, this was the bleeding edge of innovation. With this simple tool, Aristotle was able to compose a conceptual machine that would remain at the core of philosophical analysis for the next 2 millennia. Given two components, count them, two, a major and a minor premise, and a set of rules derived from the non-contradiction principle, Aristotle constructed the syllogism, history's first algorithm for the manufacturing of truth. Since then, we've developed a few more. You'll recall from Module 1 that Aristotle's Athens was dominated by the teaching of the Sophists, who rejected the notion of objective truth and instead taught that all disagreements were ultimately about the use of words. In our readings, Stephen F. Barker refers to such disagreements as verbal disputes. While the Sophists saw the ambiguity of language as an opportunity for political manipulation and other things, most philosophers have tended to regard it as sort of an unnecessary source of confusion, conflict, and misdirection at times. As a bad thing, language spinning its wheels, so to speak. Aristotelian logic is designed to strip away that ambiguity from language, to disclose the logical relations that necessarily connect one concept to another, and to reveal the deep structure underlying reason itself. We're always excavating the deep structure. Given sound premises as inputs, the syllogism churns inexorably according to rules of universal logical inference, producing as its output truths that are as objective, necessary, and certain as the results of mathematical equations. At least that's the idea. An argument, in the logical or philosophical sense, rather than the everyday sense of the term, consists in a set of premises that can be logically analyzed into a formal structure that proceeds along lines of inference from premises to conclusions. So, inference from premise to conclusions. A deductive argument, specifically, is a form of argument that proceeds from the top down. From the most general and abstract of principles, like all humans are mortal, to the most individual and specific cases, like Socrates is mortal. Big, abstract, all humans, mortality, specific case, Socrates can die, and in fact did. Aristotelian philosophy, as a whole, was deeply concerned with the distinction between form on one hand and content on the other. Think about this like a sculpture, right? A sculpture has a shape. It's a sculpture of something, typically. And it is made also out of some material, right? Such as stone or metal or whatever. In Aristotelian philosophy, the shape of the sculpture would represent its form, and the material that it's constructed from represents its content. That gets really deep. It gets really deep into sort of some metaphysical stuff. We're not going to go down the rabbit hole of that. But we are going to show where it's relevant to deductive arguments. And that is with a principle called validity. An argument can be valid, meaning its conclusions follow necessarily from its premises, purely as a matter of its formal structure, the way it's built, the way the engine is built, regardless of whether the premises are actually true, so it's content neutral. It's agnostic about the truth of the individual components, only cares about the logical relations, the structure, the form. But for an argument to be sound, the validity and soundness are the two important terms to take away from right here. For an argument to be sound, it must contain a valid formal structure, and it must come equipped, straight from the factory, with premises that are actually true. In the concept of soundness, Aristotle is bringing form and content into unity to guarantee the truth of the conclusion, and it works. It is logically impossible for an argument that is both valid and sound to generate a false conclusion. It's, in a sense, a perfect inferential engine. If you have good inputs and it's a well-constructed argument, then you're guaranteed a true output. And, 3,000 years ago, they come up with this. In Aristotelian logic, the standard formal engine of deduction is the syllogism, which is a form of deductive argument consisting of, as we've already discussed, a major premise, a minor premise, and a conclusion. The major premise, sometimes called premise one, will often take the form of an implication, what's called an implication, or a conditional statement, which has the form if P, then Q, where the if clause represents a hypothesis, which is known as the antecedent. And the then clause represents the conclusion, which is known as the consequent. And it's stuff like this where the handout is useful. So before tracing how this machinery evolved through history, let's establish some more terminology here. The boring terminological stuff. Two notable forms of valid syllogisms: modus ponens, or affirming the antecedent. That's modus ponens, affirming the antecedent, and modus tollens. These are from the Latin. Modus tollens, denying the consequent. So we have affirming the antecedent, denying the consequent. That has to do with the formal structure. Whether you're agreeing with the antecedent or whether you're refuting it, you're saying it's wrong. Modus ponens is an inferential rule for generating confirmation, right? You're trying to prove that something is right. The inference and the implication. Modus tollens, by contrast, is an inferential rule for generating disconfirmation, for refutation, trying to refute the implication. These will become especially important a little bit later in part 2, where we discuss scientific reasoning, the next lecture. So, arguments can fail in various ways. Formal logical fallacy is one way. And this occurs when the structure of the argument itself is invalid. It's got an invalid structure. A common example is called affirming the consequent, which mistakes a necessary condition for a sufficient condition. Handout goes into much more details on necessary and sufficient conditions. Very important stuff. Take a look at it. An informal fallacy, an informal logical fallacy, these are far more common, involves flawed premises rather than invalid structure. So formal has to do, again, with structure. Formal fallacy is it's poorly structured. They built the machine wrong. The argument is constructed poorly. Whereas informal has the content is flawed. The premises themselves. An example would be of an informal logical fallacy would be petitio principii, or begging the question, where an argument assumes its conclusion as part of its premises. It takes for granted what it's trying to prove. That's called question begging. Begging the question doesn't mean just raising a question as it's sort of used in common speech, and that's an easy way to just irrationally make a philosopher annoyed, is to use that one incorrectly. Begging the question is a term of art that means assuming what you're trying to prove in your premises. Informal logical fallacy. The concepts of necessary and sufficient conditions are pretty crucial. A necessary condition is required for, but does not guarantee, an outcome. I'm going to repeat that. A necessary condition is required for, but does not guarantee an outcome. A sufficient condition, on the other hand, guarantees, but is not required for an outcome. And a condition can be necessary without being sufficient, and vice versa. And there's all sorts of other properties of those. There's examples of those in the handout. Seriously, look at the handout for necessity and sufficiency. So, Aristotle's syllogistic engine is in place. He's built the syllogism out of his principle of non-contradiction. It's this inferential engine. It's powered by inferential rules, which are generated by the law of non-contradiction. Logic being used as a technology for the production of certainty. And here, it's begun its long acceleration towards increasingly sophisticated and expansive forms. So that's what we're going to track. By the 13th century, Aristotelian logic had been absorbed into the metaphysical foundations of the Christianized world. And it's important to recognize that Aristotelian philosophy, or the combination of Aristotelian and Platonic philosophy, dominated for 2 millennia. And it really wasn't until the 19th century when that began to change. So when Christianization occurred, it sort of absorbed Aristotelian logic into part of its architecture and into its foundations, its conceptual scaffolding. Medieval scholars dreamt of a universe constructed in the image of the mind of God. It would be a cosmos that was perfectly rational and perfectly comprehensible. And it was these medieval theologians who, while contemplating proofs for the existence of God, which is a big deal back in the medieval age, developed and refined the rules of modus tollens and modus ponens that we discussed earlier. So they recognized that while any hypothesis may be refuted conclusively by a single counterexample via modus tollens, no hypothesis can ever be confirmed decisively by any number of supporting observations, and we'll get back to that in part 2. As technologies evolved, like actual technologies, physical technologies evolved, more explicit mechanistic analogies emerged. The universe began to be conceived as a creation of divine clockwork, the clockwork universe, that had been wound and set in motion by its creator. God is the ultimate clockmaker kind of metaphor. And it was unspooling in accordance with laws that were both precise and predictable. In the late 17th century, the German philosopher Gottfried Leibniz extended this notion of a deterministic clockwork universe, noting that reason itself could be mathematized and transformed into a system of abstract symbols, a universal calculus of thought that could be formulated with perfect precision. All human disagreement, Leibniz argued, could be resolved in a single statement. Let us calculate. Whatever the disagreement is on, we can turn the words into algebraic symbols, calculate them mathematically, and come to a certain resolution. This was the idea of turning reason itself into this image of a precise, deterministic clockwork mechanism that had become a metaphor for the way the entire universe operated by this point. And by the time of the Enlightenment, when Leibniz is writing, this is everywhere. This metaphor is like all-encompassing. So this dream of a universal calculus proved, in this case, both prophetic and a bit premature. It would be another 200 years before a system would be developed that allowed for the realization of Leibniz's ambitions. The development of contemporary analytic philosophy can in many ways be traced The development of contemporary analytic philosophy can in many ways be traced to the development by the German logician Gottlob Frege of the predicate calculus. And here's where we're moving into contemporary logics, which get more complicated. Again, look at the handout. We're not going to be tested on contemporary. You're not going to have to learn the second order predicate calculus or modal operators. But this stuff is important because this is how logic operates now. This is how technical the machinery has become. And this is the turning point. Frege is the turning point from Aristotelian syllogisms to the sort of very complex multidimensional logics we see now. So Gottlob Frege invented the predicate calculus and in a stroke overturned 2,000 years of Aristotelian logic. His own story is kind of tragic, but extremely influential. So, where Aristotle's syllogistic clockwork ran on premises formulated in natural language, right? The symbolic coding of Frege's predicate logic translated these statements into abstract computational variables that could stand for any individual or relation and allowed for the truth of complex statements to be calculated with extraordinary mathematical precision. These innovations, in turn, inspired Russell and Whitehead, we talked about in the previous module, to push even farther in a 3-volume series of books called the Principia Mathematica, one of the great sort of experimental attempts in the history of philosophy. They attempt to derive the whole of mathematics from the principles of formal logic. The entirety of mathematics reduced to a special case of philosophical logic. They thought they could ground all math in logic. They tried, and they came close. This vision of the ultimate inferential engine would ultimately be dashed by the discovery of Gödel's incompleteness theorems, which we're not going to get into. It's not that kind of course. But Russell and Whitehead's work did generate a powerful hierarchy of first order and second order logics that could quantify over individuals and properties in new and higher dimensions of probability space. We're not going to have to get into what that means. Revolutions in the technologies of rational deduction had begun to accelerate dramatically. That's the point to take away, that logic had begun to evolve quickly. By the mid-20th century, the territory of logical analysis had expanded from statements describing actual states of affairs to formulae calculating the possibility or necessity of events in all possible worlds. All possible worlds. American philosophers such as Saul, Kripke, and David Lewis wielded modal logics. They're called modal logics. Modal is modes of possibility and necessity. And so-called possible world semantics to push reasoning beyond the analysis of what is true in the actual world and into the metaphysics of what could be true, what must be true, and what would have been true had the history of the world swerved in one direction rather than another. So they started dealing with counterfactuals, alternate possible universes in which one small event caused history to swerve this way instead of that way, calculating the probability, the truth of statements within those hypothetical universes and comparing them. And it's amazing what you can do with that tool. And this, you can look at this either as one of humanity's greatest intellectual achievements, or you can see it as one of humanity's greatest acts of sort of hubristic, rationalistic imperialism or colonialism. The machinery of logic now operated on the entire space of metaphysical possibility. We colonized the entire possibility space. Aristotle's simple principle of non-contradiction had evolved into this grand conceptual architecture, which prescribed the fundamental structure of all possible realities, right? Because we're dealing with all possibility here. As if human logic evolved on one planet and one universe could legislate terms for all universes that could ever possibly exist. And the story doesn't end there. New logics continue to proliferate. Paraconsistent logics that tolerate contradiction, quantum logics that mirror the strange behaviors of subatomic particles, fuzzy logics, where truth comes in degrees. The inferential engine has shattered into a fractal network of 1,000 machines, each grinding out its own peculiar form of certainty. But the medieval monks had already recognized what Gödel would later prove. Deductive logic comes with limitations built in. Formal proofs derived from the logicians that are derived from the logician's armchair can map the entirety of possibility space without telling us a single new fact about the actual world. Deduction generates certainty, but only inductive reasoning, as embodied in the scientific method, can generate discovery. And that brings us, obviously, to part 2 of this lecture series, where we will move from the mathematical certainties of deduction and deductive reasoning to the experimental probabilities of inductive reasoning and the scientific method. And I'll see you there.